This week in Biology 1441, we will be looking at plant reproduction and diversity. Plant groups can be distinguished by the different ways that they reproduce. Now, they all share some traits in common, some homologies, but they've evolved their own diverse characteristics that allow them to be separated from each other. So they have divergent traits as well. Now, what they all have in common is that there are two multicellular stages of the plant life cycle. The sporophyte, which is the spore-making plant. So sporo means spore and phyte means plant. Sporophyte literally means spore plant, spore-making plant. And it makes spores through the process of meiosis. So a sporophyte is diploid, and it makes spores that are haploid. They're made by meiosis. The gametophyte grows from spores, and it's a plant that makes gametes, a gametophyte. It's haploid, it makes gametes. Now, it's already haploid, so it makes gametes, sperm and egg, via the process of mitosis. Okay? Something to work on. This is something you'll have to look at and think about for a little bit to get. Now, here it is drawn out. A sporophyte is a multicellular plant. It makes spores by meiosis. Now, what is a spore? A spore is a single cell that can land on the ground and grow into a new organism. It does not fuse with other cells like a sperm fuses with an egg. It's just a cell that grows. And it grows by mitosis into a multicellular gametophyte. That gametophyte is haploid. And it makes gametes, but since it's already haploid, it makes gametes by mitosis. Those gametes fuse together to form a zygote that grows into another sporophyte. This is that alternation of generations life cycle. You have two different multicellular organisms within the life cycle of the plant. Let's apply this to a moss. In moss, the big green thing you see is the gametophyte. It's haploid. It grew from a spore. It makes gametes, sperm and egg, via mitosis. They fuse together to make a zygote that grows into a sporophyte. Now, in a moss, the sporophyte is really small and it's completely dependent on the gametophyte for nutrition. It gets all of its sugars and water and things from that gametophyte. It undergoes meiosis up here in the capsule. Spores are made and they grow into new gametophytes. So gametophytes make gametes. Gametes fuse together to make sporophytes. Sporophytes undergo meiosis to make spores that grow into new gametophytes. That is the basis of the plant life cycle, the alternation of generations. Now, if we extrapolate out and look at all of the different kinds of plants we might see, in most plants, the gametophytes are the smallest part of the life cycle, except for the mosses. In mosses, they're the most dominant form of the life cycle. They're big, green, and they live a long time. In ferns, gametophytes kind of live independently, meaning they can photosynthesize on their own. They have roots. They stick to the ground. They photosynthesize. They make gametes, but they're pretty small. They're about the size of a fingernail. When you get to the seed plants, gametophytes are really, really small, microscopic small for most of them. And they are completely dependent on the sporophyte for nutrition. They don't photosynthesize on their own. For example, pollen grains are male gametophytes. They make sperm. Female gametophytes are found inside of the developing seed, and you never even see them, but they make an egg. That egg that'll eventually be fertilized by the sperm. Up here is an example of pine gametophyte. If you've ever eaten pine nuts, you crack them out, that's the female gametophyte of a pine seed. And once you get to flowering plants, they're even smaller. They're only 8 cells big, essentially. They're really, really tiny. So as we move up the cladogram of plants, we go from big gametophytes to tiny gametophytes. And we go from short-lived sporophytes to long-lived sporophytes when we climb that cladogram. Here are the different sporophytes. So in the mosses, that stalk that made spores, it's just basically a single sporangium, a single spore-making structure. Makes spores and then it's done. But as we move up the cladogram, ferns have sporophytes that have roots and leaves and make a lot of different spores without dying, right? They live a very long time, and they can live independently of that gametophyte. So they can live independently. Now, when we move into the seed plants like the conifers, their male gametophytes are called pollen grains. Their female gametophytes are inside the seed. And the big green thing you see, once again, is your sporophyte. Same thing with flowering plants like this oak tree. Its gametophytes are really, really tiny. The big green thing that you see is that diploid sporophyte. Okay? So in mosses, sporophytes are tiny, and they depend on the gametophyte for food. But in everyone else, they can live on their own. And in the case of ferns, the gametophyte can live on its own as well. If you go back, you can see the fern gametophyte's green. It can photosynthesize down here in the corner. But in seed plants, the gametophytes are really, really tiny, and they can't photosynthesize. If we look up on the bottom of a fern leaf, we would see lots and lots of these structures. These are all called sporangia, and that's where spores are made in ferns. In these sporangia that undergo meiosis to make spores, and then the spores, when they dry out, crack open, and the spores fling out into the environment and grow into a fern gametophyte. There's a lot of diagrams of this in your book, but we'll try not to swamp you with them all in this pre-lab. Now, once that gametophyte starts to grow, it's going to make structures, either both of these or it might make just one of them, but it makes an archegonium, or plural archegonia. That's where eggs are produced. And it can produce sperm, which is done in an antheridia, or plural antheridia, singular antheridium. And one thing that's really cool is that mosses and ferns have swimming sperm, whereas seed plants, the sperm have lost their tails. So in seed plants, no tails on the sperm. It's an adaptation to life on land, as we'll see. So what we'll see is ferns and mosses are more closely tied to the water, to standing water, like their algal ancestors. But seed plants are much more adapted to life on land, and that's what we want to focus on this week. Our goals are to learn some of the differences between the groups, how to identify them, and then how certain groups are better adapted to life on land than others. And then we're also going to look at some of the specialized structures in those organisms. All right, now in seed plants, the female gametophyte is in the ovule. Ovule is the name of a developing seed. Okay, so you're going to have to work on that term, because ovule does not mean egg in this case. An ovule is a developing seed, and inside is the gametophyte where the egg is made. And a male gametophyte is a pollen grain. Basically, it's, if we look at this diagram, we have a spore. A spore undergoes, a spore grows by mitosis, but in this case, all of the cells that are made by mitosis stay inside of the wall of the spore. It's kind of weird, but that's how you get a pollen grain. So we have a spore that grows into a couple of cells. In this case, here's a pollen grain. This is the wall that used to be the wall of the spore. Then inside we have two different cells here. The pollen tube nucleus cell, or I should say I guess this is the nucleus in this diagram. So we have two cells, the pollen tube cell, there's its nucleus, and the generative cell. That generative cell will later divide in two. Basically what you have here is a sperm delivery system, which is what the pollen tube grows into, and this one splits in half, forming two sperm. So a mature pollen grain is just two sperm and what I call a sperm elevator, the pollen tube, the delivery system for those sperm. And the outside of the pollen grain is covered in a thick, crunchy layer of sporopollenin, which is a super resistant biopolymer that's kind of like a spacesuit for those pollen grains that keep the sperm and the pollen tube from drying out. So you won't see this in ferns. Ferns have spores that grow into gametophytes. Gametophytes make gametes that grows another fern. But seed plants have pollen grains. Pollen grains are a male gametophyte that makes sperm. Okay, now here's a quick life cycle of a pine to kind of drive the seed plant thing home. So let's start with pollen cones. There are male pollen cones, which we will not be able to find in the fall, but you'll find them in the spring. They have the sporangia on them that make little microspores, little tiny spores. Those spores grow up to be pollen grains. Okay. Meanwhile, so those pollen grains are a pollen tube and 2 sperm. Meanwhile, in the female cone, you have the cone scales. Inside the cone scales of that cone, you have a female spore here called a megasporocyte. You don't have to memorize that, but you have a sporangium inside of that ovule, that developing seed. Inside of that ovule is your megaspore, which is the female spore. It grows up to be a female gametophyte. All right, confused yet? Well, we'll try to unconfuse you as we go. But inside of that developing seed is that female gametophyte and 2 eggs. It made 2 eggs. In comes the pollen grain. The sperm are deposited by the pollen tubes. The eggs get fertilized, and one of those embryos will survive to become the embryo in the seed. So there's 2 of them in there, kind of a backup plan. One will actually survive to grow into a new pine tree, and then it will fall on the ground, and up comes a pine tree. Okay, so the female gametophytes are inside the seed. The male gametophytes are the pollen grains. Then when it comes to flowering plants, kind of a similar thing to the conifers, but flowering plants have these showy flowers that have in the middle this thing called a carpel, which consists of a stigma, style, and ovary. Inside of that are the ovules, the developing seeds. Inside of the ovules would be the female gametophyte. Then out here we have the stamens, which consist of an anther and then a stalk called a filament. That's where the male spores are made, the microspores, and those grow up to be pollen grains. And then we have lots of different organisms that will pollinate these things. So let me talk to you about the difference between fertilization and pollination. Pollination is when a bee comes in here, gets pollen on its back, flies to another flower, and rubs pollen on the stigma of the carpel. That's pollination. Fertilization is when the pollen tube in that pollen grain elongates and grows all the way down here, plugs into a developing seed or ovule, and then the sperm travel down and fertilize the egg in there and create an embryo. That's fertilization. One other thing I want to mention with seed plants, here's a drawing of one of those ovules or the developing seeds. It has a bunch of parts. We're going to worry about 2 parts. This big thing right here that we're going to call the central cell that has 2 nuclei in it, and this cell right here that has the egg cell in it. So that pollen tube grows down, grows into the opening of the ovule, and 2 sperm are released. One fertilizes the egg to make the embryo, the zygote, which grows into the embryo. The other sperm fuses with this big central cell. So then there's 1, 2, 3 nuclei, the third one being from the sperm, all fusing together. This thing gets fertilized, and it develops into what we call endosperm, or food for the embryo. And if you dissect a seed, you might actually find that that endosperm inside. That's what we grind up to make flour, for example, is that fertilized central cell. Coconut milk is another example. That's food for the developing embryo. And you only see that double fertilization in flowering plants. You don't see it in gymnosperms or any of the conifers. They don't have that, only in the flowering plants. Okay, so that was a whirlwind tour. We'll need to clarify a few things probably in lab, but remember, it all boils down. All of this stuff is just whistles and bells. The second part of this pre-lab, just trying to explain that pollen grains are male gametophytes, etc. All of it is just whistles and bells built on top of the moss life cycle. And the moss life cycle starts off with a spore that grows into a gametophyte. The gametophyte makes gametes. Gametes fuse together to make another sporophyte, which undergoes meiosis to make more spores. So work on that, and watch the video. Just try to get a basic understanding, and we'll go from there when we get to lab this week. All right, see you then.